So to that, and then he wrote this book about surviving the technologizing of our mind, talking about some positive and some negative effects. The positive secondary effect is the perpetual need for connectivity. I guess all of you would probably agree with being more or less always on. We're always on. Once you get this thing in our pocket, we're perpetually connected. Interesting, increased sensation of ego, increased self-esteem, and increased involvement of the hippocampus, which has other neural consequences. However, the negative secondary effects are extremely interesting. Clearly, we know one of them, fragmented attention. We'll get back to that. But what's interesting is that with some younger kids now, there has been a marked loss of the ability to recognize faces or recognize expression on the faces. Now, I find that very interesting because the history of individuation starts with the Greeks, with the chore, those statues, those very formal, hieratic kind of statues with very little expression. Or you can go back to the Chinese tradition of painting and painting people, also practically no physiognomy. To go from the history of the chore via Laocoon and Praxiteles and the extreme definition that comes, all the way to Mona Lisa, you are looking at a history of the definition of the representation of people in iconography, in culture, and in various ways. This definition accompanies an auto-definition that we have actually learned to introduce in ourselves by learning to read and write. The fundamental difference being that, of course, the Greeks introduced the reading and writing. That is, in fact, a development of identity. And, of course, the other one, the lessening of interpersonal skills, depends which one you taught. There is a program which I recommend you go and check called Digital Mirror. Digital Mirror is a program that studies your email and your various practices of existing online to find out how you relate to people via email as opposed to how you relate to them in real life. And the difference is so shocking to most people that they don't recognize it. They say, that's not me. It studies the time you take to respond to certain people. It studies the frequency of the people you respond to. It studies all kinds of stuff automatically, and bingo, you suddenly find yourself with a profile you never thought you had. So it's fascinating. Of course, I am very interested in this issue of the hypertextual intelligence, which I associate with traditional Chinese modes of thinking. Why? Because, in fact, what the Chinese live in the perpetual present that Siegfried talked about this morning. They actually have no tense for the future. Everything is now, more or less. But everything is now in connection that you have to make yourself. The I Ching, which is represented by this thing, is a divination technology that allows you to put together things that you didn't think were together in first. Anybody who reads a horoscope will know that in no way does the two or three sentences that are addressed in that paper to 350,000 people has anything to do with your destiny. And yet, very quickly, you put it all together, and bingo, suddenly you know you're going to meet this wonderful person or get this great job or get sick. I don't know. But the point is, there is this kind of tendency we have of putting things together in the context that we are finding ourselves into. So hypertextual intelligence, for me, is actually something where we're now going. Carr's argument is this one. If your reading is constantly interrupted, your thinking is always trying to catch up in a fragmentary and superficial way. Superficial learning, thinking without depth. Well, why? Because of the damning effect of hypertext. To navigate between linked documents implies a mental gymnastic. You need to evaluate the hyperlinks, decide where to click, adapt to different formats, all matters absolutely foreign to the processing of reading. This activity disturbs concentration and weakens comprehension. Sounds like a very valid argument, a very strong view on this. He calls it switching cost. STM, short-term memory, is an information tap. When we read, this information tap guarantees a continuous flow that we can control to regulate the speed and the rhythm of reading. Maybe. Concentrating on the text, we can easily transfer much information little bit by little bit in our long-term memory. That's because Carr actually believes there's only two kinds of memory. But my colleague at the University of, I'm to finish this one first. Online, we are confronting a multiplicity of information taps at maximum aperture. Our mental processing jumps from one tap to the other, getting lost in between. We can only transfer a minimal chaos of data from different taps instead of a continuous and regulated stream of information. I find that ridiculous because, of course, when we are online and we are looking at things, whichever form it takes, we actually are perfectly capable of actually importing it into our mind.